Hey, it's Eric from Cornerstone Northwest Education. Thank you for joining me on this short course on what lurks below in the crawl space. Nobody wants to go in the crawl space. I actually like it, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in this course. I'm going to show you some of the more common things that I'm looking for when I'm in a crawl space, things our clients need to know about, and some things they need to make some pretty big decisions on. This is one video in a series of 3 where I take you where nobody ever goes: the roof, the attic, and the crawl space. So let's get started. Here we go. Let's go into the crawl space. Okay, time to take you to my favorite place. It's the crawl space. As a home inspector, if you have worked with me, you've heard me say this. I actually like going into the crawl space. And there's really 2 reasons. One is I'm going to go down there. I'm going to take a bunch of pictures. I'm going to take some videos for my clients. If I don't find anything significant, I'm the hero. And guess what? If I find something significant, I'm also the hero. So I really enjoy it, and it's kind of like being a detective without the gun and the cool badge. Never mind. So when I go in the crawl space, I'm really looking at these 6 major items. Kind of like the attic. It's not to say that I'm not going to call out other things I see, but these are kind of the main things I'm looking at. And let's get in the first one right now. Let's talk about the foundation. Now, it's very common for me to see these typical cracks, and these are what's called common or typical, and there are several reasons for this. Concrete cracks, that's what it does, and when concrete cures, it is going to shrink. So these are typically known as shrinkage cracks. Now, I put them in my report to let the client know that I saw them and that they are typical or not a huge deal, but to keep their eye on them. Now, when I'm in the crawl space, you can see that I've got a much better view of the entire foundation. And a lot of times on the outside, I can't see the entire foundation. Like in this instance here, I might be able to put a flashlight down through one of the holes in the lattice there and see a little bit, but I can't see a whole lot from the outside. So that's the great advantage of being in the crawl spaces. Now I can see the entire foundation. Now, sometimes foundation cracks are hidden and they're hard to see. Here's an example of what's called a Parge Coat, or like a stucco coating on a concrete wall. And what I saw on that wall was a tiny, tiny crack on the outside. But on the other side of that wall, when I got underneath the home, this is what I saw. So basically you could stick a ballpoint pen in that crack, and that's bad. That is significant cracking. And what's happening here is, this piece wants to do this and this piece wants to do this. And that's because the ground underneath is moving. A home like this, I'm going to see indications not only in the foundation of a crack, I'm able to see inside the crawl space that I don't always see from outside. Here's a good example of some decorative block type work, but this is like a faux finish. It's a faux cladding on the outside of the foundation, because underneath, this is what I saw. So you can see here that there is significant cracking, and anytime you see a cinder block crack in the middle like this one has, that's bad. Not completely untypical for them to crack in the mortar joints. Now, obviously not this bad, but in less severe cracking. But in this case, you can see something's happening. This entire segment is sinking, and it's not taking the other part with it. So that's what's creating that significant cracking in the foundation, which once again I couldn't see from the outside. So let's move on to vapor barriers. A vapor barrier does exactly what it sounds like it does. So this floor underneath the home should have a vapor barrier, and it's just thick black plastic, and it keeps water vapor from moving from the ground up into the home. Now, water moves in 2 ways. There's liquid water and then there's vapor water. And it changes its form depending upon several factors, but it can be liquid water in the ground, transform itself to vapor water, and move up into the house. And depending upon the conditions on the house itself, it can transform or condense back into water. And when you have standing water or sitting water in a damp crawl space on structural members, you will get mold and mildew and fungus growth and all of the things that are bad and you don't want to happen. That will happen. So here's a great example of the condition that would lead to some mold growth. This is a damp crawl space. This is saturated. And by the way, this is all from downspouts and grade leading back to the house. So all of the water on the outside of the home is just wanting to be back underneath the home. And you can see the fungal growth happening on the members here. And this is what it should look like. So here you have the thick black plastic, and actually this is a little bit short. You see that damp ground on the edge there on the foundation. So this vapor barrier should be extended to cover that entire ground or all of the ground, much like this. And the correct way to do this is actually to run it up on the walls a little bit. We don't always see that, but that would be in a more ideal scenario or installation. And just another example of what we should see. So let's move on to insulation. Now, vapor barrier and insulation is kind of a 1-2 punch from preventing that cold, moist air from moving up into the house from the ground. So this is a picture from just a moment ago. You can see the damp ground here and the cool, you know it's a cool crawl space, and that air is just wanting to move right up into the house. So the reason I say it's kind of a 1-2 punch is the insulation underneath the home a lot of times has what's called a face, and in that face is a vapor barrier as well. In fact, here I'm laying on my back in a crawl space and I can see the underside of this insulation, and it says apply this side towards the living space. Now once again, I'm on my back looking up. So in this instance, they installed this insulation completely upside down because this area here is called the face, and it actually has a vapor barrier built into it. So that vapor barrier should always be on the warm side of a surface. So in this instance, it should be up against the floor and not hanging down into the crawl space. So lots of bad things happen when you get it upside down. You can get all kinds of mold and fungal growth in between the insulation and the home itself. We see lots of this. So there was insulation, but it has fallen. So it's the same as not being there at all. And this is kind of an extreme case here where all of this has fallen and all of this has fallen. And once it's on the ground and wet, it's ruined. You got to rip it all out and put new stuff in there. This is the same house I was just describing a moment ago with a really wet, damp ground and the fungal growth happening on some of the framing members. In this instance, when they built this home, they put a vapor barrier up against the home. People think that this is going to keep the vapor and the moisture out of the home, but what happens is, see all that discoloration? That is all mold and fungal growth that is now trapped between this plastic layer and the home itself. So it was well intended, but it really made a mess. It does have the potential to create some real health issues up in the home, not to mention all the damage it's going to do to the wooden members of the structure. So let's move on to water intrusion. Now when I see a home like this, what I see is I see a roof plane that's going to collect water. This entire roof is going to collect water, and that water needs to go somewhere. It's going to go down the downspouts, but then there's a big question of where does it go, because a lot of times that water just sits right here. And when water sits right there next to the home, inevitably it's going to end up under the home. This was a home in a rainstorm, and look at the water just absolutely raging out of that downspout area. And that water here is just going right back underneath the home and creating all kinds of structural and potential health issues for sure. Here we see an attempt at water management, and we see the water now collecting 6 or 8 feet off of the home, but then ultimately this water just saturates the ground and it's going to come right back and affect the home anyhow. So you have to be really careful about what you do with the water. The best thing is you got to get it away from the home, and then with grade, keep it moving away from the home, out of your yard, and ideally into the neighbor's yard. Just kidding. So here's that same house, and you see the saturated ground, and we talked about what it's doing to these members here, the structural members, and then also potentially up into the home. And all of this is because of that water management issue. So the water intrusion is coming from water management or mismanagement from the downspouts and also the grade of the home. Once again, get that water moving away from the home. And ultimately, a damp crawl space with improper water management is going to look like this. And that is true water intrusion. That's kind of the key definition of water intrusion, is that standing water in the crawl space. This was another crawl space. Consequently, home inspectors are not going to crawl through that. And there's several reasons why, but I'll give you the main reason. In all crawl spaces, there is animal feces, and many times there are dead animals. So there are carcasses down there, even if it's just mice. All of those types of animals are known to carry disease. So in a dry crawl space, a home inspector can kind of navigate around maybe some dead animals or some areas that are really dense with animal feces. But when you submerge all of that in water, now every square inch of that water is now infested. And so there's all kinds of nastiness and disease happening in that water. So that's why home inspectors, and really anybody, that's why other professions, they're not going to crawl through that either. It's just unsafe. And in that house, we're talking about consequences here. In that house, here's that mold growth that's happening in this case, it was in the closets of the home. Those are areas that are not going to get a whole lot of air circulation, and maybe the heaters aren't going to heat those small spaces quite like they should, and you're going to have that fungal growth. And that's just the consequence of all of that moisture below the home. It will make its way into the home. It has no choice. It's just going to migrate into the home. This is a great picture of improper water management at the downspouts. There's actually a downspout on the other side of this wall, and the water is just laying right up against the foundation. This is all active water intrusion. And then what you can't see in this picture, just outside of frame, is a post that's holding up one of the main beams in the center of the house, is completely rotted, and it's just hanging out into space because of living in that damp environment. Wood rot just had its way with it, and it needs replaced. Let's move on to plumbing leaks. And this is what most plumbing leaks look like. So just a little bit of dampness underneath. And then you can see this pipe here is stained. So that water has been cascading down this pipe and then dripping down here for quite some time. Another example of a typical water leak. So it starts up here, ends up there. And you don't want plumbing leaks to persist. There are a lot of reasons for that. Some of it is what we've already talked about, is moisture living down below, makes its way into the home. But also, a damp crawl space invites all kinds of things that you don't want living in your crawl space. And if the wooden members of your home stay wet, it will invite things like damp wood termites, hence the term damp wood. And there's some other types of wood destroying organisms that love that damp wood. So don't give it the opportunity, and that's why plumbing leaks are a big deal. Now, sometimes the plumbing leaks are what I call real gushers. So here's a pretty good picture, and it's kind of hard to tell, but in this entire area, this kind of haze is just water spray, and this thing is just gushing. So what I heard as soon as I entered the crawl space was the hissing sound of the water. So that's your first indication that's pretty good water leak. And on the next slide is a short video of what this thing actually looks and sounds like. So that is definitely one of the more aggressive plumbing leaks that we see. Here's a manufactured home, and this is the batting insulation that is just full of water. See that huge bulge? This is just a tiny symptom of what's happening up here. So here's an example of a homeowner fix. So to secure this elbow to this drain pipe, somebody tried to use duct tape, which probably worked for a little while. Now, if you've worked with me for any length of time, you've heard me say there are two enemies to all homes. Enemy number one is water, more specifically water intrusion into the home. Enemy number two is homeowners. And just to kind of wrap up with plumbing leaks, whenever you see sagging supply plumbing like this, we're going to write that up as improperly supported plumbing, because gravity wins, and you can see pulling these fairly heavy pipes now full of water. And what it really does is just places all kinds of stress actually on the joints, and the joints can start leaking from that pressure and that stress. So we'll wrap up this particular lesson with a short discussion on the structure. When I'm in a crawl space, I'm looking at the floor structure, and part of that floor structure is, what is the floor structure resting on? And that's the beams. And then what's holding up the beams? Well, these posts. And what are the posts sitting on? and there's going to be different types of footer configurations. And that's actually a really good looking crawl space. So here's a good example of a post holding up a beam, but what is holding up the post? So this is a giant concrete footer down below, which is great, but what might be hard to see is this post has slid off of the footer. So that's because this beam up top has twisted over time. A lot of times when they install lumber in a home, it's not completely dry. So over time, it's going to keep drying, and sometimes it twists. So this post has slid off of the footer, and I will look at how the post is connected to the beam and how the post is connected to the footer. And if they're not connected in a more positive way, I'll always make that recommendation. Here's an example of a post that's really not connected. It's just kind of sitting here on an old block of concrete or an old patio paver, and it's just kind of holding up the back end of this house. And here's a great example. This is a main beam in a small cabin up near Mount Rainier. And this main beam up above, I could feel in the floor. It was kind of spongy and had a bit of a dip. So I expected to see something similar to what you're seeing here once I got down underneath the home. And what this is about is there are actually rules about how deep and how wide you can cut a notch into a main beam. And I think they went a little bit too deep on this. And then so the area that was left, so this area here, was weakened by the area that's missing, which is this area here. And then what you see is the beam just gave up underneath the weight and it cracked and sagged. So that entire beam needs to be replaced. And then I see a lot of this. So this is a log that's holding up a 1930s home. There was no indication in the home that there were any foundation issues at all. That log has probably been there from the beginning. And this is actually the same home. So there's the log, and look, this is held up with firewood. I will always comment to the homeowner on this that there is maybe a more complete way or a more structurally sound way to hold up the home to ensure its longevity. Of course, it's been there since the 1930s, so I have to be delicate about how I approach that. But I just say, hey, this home here has some non-standard building techniques. You may want to have that looked at and maybe evaluated for a more permanent type solution, just as an example. And then sometimes this is all kinds of wrong. So here's a block with a piece of wood and maybe a paver holding up the main beam of a home. So those are things that I would definitely comment on. And then finally is a fairly tall crawl space, and here's like a 6x6 or a 4x6 piece of lumber, and it's just kind of tacked into place up top, and then it's balancing on a tiny portion of masonry block down below. So I would definitely comment on that. And then a lot of these columns, actually the masonry work was incorrect and was a little precarious. So in instances like that, I will definitely comment. So that's a little bit about the crawl space. Obviously we could go on and on about each section, but once again, I'm not here to make you a home inspector. I'm just here to give you an idea of some of the things I'm looking at, and then some of the why behind these things, why they matter. And then we talked about the consequences of not doing some of these things correctly. That's the crawl space, and those are the things that lurk below. I hope you learned just a little something. So that's it. That's what I see in the crawl space. I hope this will help you help your clients navigate that post-inspection thrash, and I hope it makes your life just a little bit easier. So thank you for joining me, and we'll see you next time.